this in the last meeting of this group, but we have a big agenda. And so let's go ahead and dive in. I think we might have a couple more folks join. I think I know all of you. I was going to say I'm Katrina, I lead the Buildings and Homes team in Denver's climate office, but I think I'm getting to where I know a lot of these groups. I think I know everybody here, but let's still do a round of introductions, and then we'll dive into our agenda. Just as a reminder, this is one of 4 working groups that we're running right now to further develop some of the highest impact proposals that are being considered by the Denver Energy Code Committee. These will go back then to the Code Committee for a vote in July. This is the second meeting of this energy modeling working group out of 4. We have 2 more meetings. So our focus today is going to be on the PEUI proposal because there's a lot of interest from energy modelers in our community in having that option for code compliance. In our first meeting, we hope to wrap up the proposal or get very close to wrapping it up today so that we can spend your next meeting developing details on the Appendix G proposal, and then we will hopefully have a discussion in your 4th meeting on kind of how things all come together. Do we still need the C407 modeling path? Do we have any final tweaks to PEUI and Appendix G modeling proposals? So with that, let's go through introductions. I'll run through city staff first, and we'll start with the climate office. So Courtney, do you want to say hi?
Hi everyone, Courtney Anderson, focusing on the code adoption process.
Thanks, Courtney. Tom?
Tom Gleason, Green Building Outreach Administrator, just here to listen in and take notes.
Thanks, Derek.
Derek Valenti, alternate compliance, so working with people who are struggling to get up and hit the goals of the ordinance.
Great, and just for this group, Derek's new to this group. I thought he's implementing the Energized Denver ordinance, and I thought he'd be interested to hear some of what we're discussing around how PEUI will work in new buildings, since he's implementing how existing buildings reach EUI targets for our team. Okay, let's go through CPD. Eric, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, good morning. Eric Browning, Chief Building Official, Community Planning and Development.
Thanks. Chuck?
Chuck Bartell, the Mechanical Plumbing Plan Review Supervisor.
Thanks, Chuck. Hi, Christy.
Christy Collins, Community Planning and Development, working on various high performance initiatives that we have going on.
Thanks, Christy. Let's go through our stakeholders. Taylor, you're first on my screen.
Taylor Roberts, at Group 14 Engineering Energy Efficiency Consultant.
Great. Sue?
Sue Riley, Group 14.
Thanks. And Mohit?
Yeah, Mohit Mehta, ME Engineers, Building Performance Team.
Thank you so much, Mohit. And Sean, do you want? I think everybody knows you, but say hi.
Hi everyone, Sean Denniston, New Buildings Institute, Denver's technical advisor in this process.
Okay, great. So it looks like maybe a couple of the other energy modelers can't join us today. I know, actually thinking back on it, Elizabeth Gilmore is out. And we'd had Linda from Ambient Energy. But so I think that the folks we have here from our stakeholders are those who have been working with us a bit over the last couple of weeks to develop this, but I still think it will be good to review where we've landed on PEUI, make sure it all makes sense to this whole group. So Taylor and Sean, do you want to walk through, and I don't know which of you wants to lead the walkthrough, the proposal you've developed, and then I think it's also going to be useful to just show the group briefly the second document that was sent around, which was the Denver modeling protocols for PEUI, which don't need to be final right now for the code committee, but just so people can see what that will entail. And maybe we can also talk a little bit of, if we like the code proposal, about what it will take to kind of finalize those protocols, because we'll need to map out a process on that.
Yeah, do you want me to run through it, Sean, or do you want to?
I am fine either way. I have it open. I can bring it up.
Okay.
The right one. Yes. All right. So can everyone see that all right? Is it large enough for you?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this adds an additional modeling option to the code. Right now, it adds it as part of an appendix, but I think that's something that we could discuss whether it should be in the main body or an appendix. We originally wrote it as an appendix because we saw it as being something fairly forward-looking, but it does have language that makes the appendix available to everyone. And what it does is it allows, in some circumstances, for projects to just go ahead and model to an EUI. We utilize the PEUI terminology that is already in the standard Appendix G proposal, just as the PEUI, that's establishes the target. And then it tells you to go through the modeling procedures. This is the CD 102.1, that you have to meet the target that's in the table. Right now, this table just has targets for a small number of building types where the outcomes of those building types are relatively consistent. And so having a target-based approach is more reasonable. And then it directs the user to use Appendix G as modified by this external document that Katrina talked about. The purpose of doing it this way is that target-based approaches are really the absolute leading edge policy approach to modeling. And so we don't have an especially well-established set of procedures for doing it like we do, say, under Appendix G. So by putting this in a separate document that's outside of code, that allows the city to update it as the needs arise. As projects encounter issues that haven't been anticipated before, it allows, all of these modeling procedures just to be more nimble and more responsive to users' needs without having to go back and amend the code to be able to amend the procedures. And that's the big thing that's driving why this section is so small. It doesn't have to be big because most of the stuff we would put in code, we'd put in that modeling procedures instead. And then it also includes some other specific things that we are fairly certain about. One is based on some discussions, including modeling certification based on our discussion last time, that you can, you have two ways to regulate your models, regulate the model itself or regulate the modeler. This just sets a somewhat higher, well, I think a legitimately higher bar for modelers, so that the modelers, that the city has greater certainty that the modelers are actually qualified to be modeling this way, this more advanced way. But from my perspective, and I'll say this one is mine personally, this also kind of ensures that fly-by-night modelers don't start to enter the market and undermine the market. This is something that has been seen in California as modeling has gotten more broadly used, that some of the shops really just aren't very good. And so
Hey,
this.
Sean, can I jump in and interrupt? Just one comment here. I know we talked about this last time to standardize and, the modeling folks that are producing these reports or will be doing this. Can we do that for the software selection as well? Or is that too much? Like, can we put something like it has to be ASHRAE standard 140 validated software? Because folks are using everything and anything, right? Or is that too much?
So right now, I would need to double check. I believe Appendix G does have limitations.
Does it have it?
On what is allowed to be used. We can double check to make sure, and we can double check to make sure whatever is there is appropriate for these purposes. Yeah, because you need
They go hand in
fully
hand.
fledged modeling software. You can't be using
Exactly.
train trace to
Well, I'm
model
telling you,
building
folks
for
are doing
this.
all that, so that's why I've seen examples of that, and I just wanted to call that out since we were setting the bar for the level of skill the modeler should have. I think the capability of the software should be validated as well. So anyway,
Okay.
just thought. Sorry, keep going.
Right. So we'll double check that. So it does identify the ASHRAE Building Energy Modeling Professional Certification. It does allow for an approved equivalent certification if something comes up, into the scene in between now and when these projects are actually going through. We could also modify this to have, a certain number of projects that have gone through the Denver process, modeled projects through the Denver process, or an equivalent experience. But that's a little bit squishier. So we just started with the certification, and we can talk if we need to modify that. There is requirements for documentation, and it includes, well, this is actually in the 103, that the modeler who is supervising the performance modeling. So this does allow for other modelers to work on the model, but there has to be someone with a certification supervising the modeling, and that person has to be identified in the documents. Then there are other documentation requirements that are fairly standard. It is clear about how renewable energy will be treated, and it is also clear about the energy uses that can be excluded from the model. Some of these things could go into the modeling procedures, but these have such a big impact on this path that they're in the code language for now. I think that's a good place to start. Are there any questions, or anyone who worked on kind of the sub-working group that discussed this? Is there anything that you would like to add?
I'd say Taylor, add anything since you were helping with the drafting of this, but also Mohit or Taylor or Sean, I don't know if one of you wants to summarize a bit of how we arrived at these particular modeled performance target numbers, since we all met to discuss that.
Yeah, I think I can start, and then anyone fill in. But so the first thing we did is we just really wanted to simplify it, right, and make it only a couple building types, like we talked about, like some prominent building types. So that was the first step. Second step was, what are these EUIs? So we kind of were looking at both the modeled EUIs that Sean had provided based on the prototype buildings and the code, and then also looking at Energized Denver. And essentially all we did was say, for hotel and office, the Energized Denver numbers were actually better, so we reduced those by 10%. And then for the apartment, that modeling protocol was better, so we utilized that one to try to make sure we were using the more stringent EUI, and that we weren't making like a loophole that this pathway was easier than a different code pathway, be it prescriptive or performance. So that's just kind of how those three numbers were derived.
Thanks. Anything others want to add? Courtney, I don't know if you would want to reflect a little bit about our conversation with Kristen Whitco from Boulder, because I know she's not here today. She was going to try to join. I think a lot of that was more focused on the protocols. But I don't know if you want to summarize, or I can try to, just sort of in general, what has Boulder's experience been having this option in code?
Sure, yeah, I can speak to that a bit. She was very supportive of us pursuing this this pathway. They encourage projects to pursue that pathway in Boulder if possible. She liked the direction of us using Appendix G schedules in the protocol document. So a lot of her comments were based around that, like Katrina mentioned, adding in things like Equest, but not trace modeling software, like Mohit also mentioned. Making sure we reference the protocol document within the code proposal. Not that the protocol document would be part of it, but just to make sure we're referencing that. She was very supportive of the BEMP credentials as well. She did also mention, and maybe it's worth a discussion here too, of allowing a path for mixed use between these building types. So between apartment and office, do we want to look at what those targets could be so that we're not excluding, or do we want to start very simple? So that was something that also came out of that meeting. And then, yeah, just making sure we're working with our energy modelers to help the pathway for the protocol document, especially around the plug loads and equipment power densities. She said Boulder didn't have that quite right. So we would want to, work with you all to see what those right numbers are.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary of our conversation with her. And then she had, like you said, you mentioned there a few specific recommendations around what goes in Denver modeling rules and procedures. But and maybe the only other thing I would note here is that she did feel like this is something that is manageable for the review teams. When she left Boulder, she wrote a set of instructions, a sort of 10 things to look for when you're reviewing what comes in under these Denver modeling rules and protocols for the Boulder reviewers. And I don't know that we have that from her yet, but she was happy to share that with us. So we'll keep trying to get that from her. So there would sort of end up being, this code proposal, the more detailed modeling rules and protocols for our community. But I think we could come up with some guidance, because we know this is new for the reviewers, in terms of and sort of model that on what Boulder is looking at in terms of sort of how to review this, how to have some kickoff conversations with projects so that they know what's expected if they took this path, and do some planning for sort of how we would implement this. But we have a good model there from Boulder. So maybe with that, I'll pause and let's just discuss this a bit, and then we can maybe dive into those modeling rules and procedures. Does that sound good? Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, sorry if I'm being dense here, but what about all of the other building types? Is there something in the paragraph up above that addresses anything that's not an apartment, hotel, or office? And maybe it's there and I just don't see it on the screen, but I think this is different version maybe than what's linked on the agenda. I'm not sure. I apologize. So what are there no targets at all for the other building types, or is there a baseline?
So this is an optional modeling path. So if your building is not one of these three types, you would need to use whatever other modeling option the committee ends up saying is available, which would be a reference model based approach. One modification that could be made here, and it would be interesting to see what CPD thinks about it, is whether we would want to include the option to basically set an EUI for other building types that gets approved by the code official. That does make compliance more complex. It puts more on CPD staff, which is why it's not included right now, but that might be something that you end up getting requests for.
And that is something that Boulder does, just reflecting that conversation with Kristen. But they have a lot less project volume coming through. But we could also possibly reference, Energized Denver, 10% better than Energized Denver for other building types. But like you heard here, like that was the apartment standard for Energized Denver wasn't as stringent as what the ASHRAE studies were showing was kind of appropriate, right? And so
Yeah, I would generally say we probably don't want to use Energized Denver as the targets, even a % reduction. The Energized Denver, even if you go 10, sometimes even 20% better than Energized Denver, you can be below ASHRAE 2019, which the Denver Energy Code for new construction is hoping to go beyond even that. So I think that creates the opportunity for a loophole for some building types. Other building types are closer together. So I think it would need to, if we did it that way, it would need to be a project by project approval process.
Yeah. So I might toss that back to you, Eric. Do you want to go down that path, or do we just get started with the most common building types for this code cycle? I guess.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with keeping it limited to these three, as long as we have the appropriate, code reference or pointer to the pathway for not these three building types, because those are the questions that we're going to get. So the more clarity that we can provide, whether it's in the code language itself or in the modeling rules and procedures, Just as long as it's clear, that's all I'm asking for. But I would be interested to hear, Chuck, I think you and I have spoken about this a little bit in the past, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts just on those 3 building types as well.
No, I think they're good. It's a good standard building type. My only question would be very rarely do we see a office building that's 100% office. Like the garage, how is the garage area handled in these models? How is the first floor retail handled in these models? Or would that just prohibit those buildings from being able to use this path, or is each one of those going to require a conversation with the building official to create a PEUI target for that building?
Yeah, I think how Boulder handles it, I think was helpful that they had in there that you could do weighted average. I don't know if we would have to add a retail here to be able to do that. Parking garage should always be excluded from this calculation. It should just be.
I mean, the energy use is included, but the area is excluded. I mean, we've done the last 2 high rises in town in Denver, at least. So, that's how we do it. Regarding retail, at least the 2 we have done, they don't have much. I mean, they might have a cafe, type building, but predominantly it's a spec office building. Yeah, there's issues with if 2 tenants or 3 large tenants, if that's the corporate headquarters and they get a data center put in there and they add, 7 crack units each, then that's a little different. Someone's going to have to make a case of, if they're exceeding that number, because we have 3 tenants here in this building that have, data centers in there. But that would apply to hotel as well, right? I personally think hotel is a little bit of a wild card. It depends on how many swimming pools and does it have a spa, dining, 24/7 room service, how many restaurants, and it just makes the bigger one is, some folks might just say, hey, we can't meet that target, and we'll just take our laundry offsite. So the energy is still being used and consumed in Denver, but the hotel looks good. So I think that needs to be some consideration, understanding that there could be hotel teams that come and make a case for why they need that higher EUI, and whoever reviews it will have to understand that, because we don't want them to not provide the amenities and on-site laundry and whatever 3-4 star facilities, spas, and things like that. So like Taylor was saying, one of his multifamily folks were thinking about getting rid of the swimming pool because they were not going to meet that. We don't want them to do that. So similar.
I wonder, but others feel free to chime in, but I wonder if that's a good bridge to show the group and review at least the initial draft of the Denver modeling rules and protocols, because I think some of that's going to be decided there. And I think we have a decision to make as a city. This is why I invited Derek to this meeting. What needs to be adjusted in the model? Like if you're going to have something like a swimming pool, do you need to put that in the model here and hit the 38 still? Or do we let you just exclude the swimming pool from your modeling, but we know that we have a standard adjustment for it when you have to actually submit your EUI for performance under Energized Denver? Because Derek and the Energized Denver team are going to have certain things that have a very standard adjustment, like a swimming pool. Where it doesn't require new modeling, it's just now your EUI is adjusted by this much if you've got a swimming pool. So that's why Derek's here, so these 2 things sync up. But is there anything else someone wanted to chime in on to kind of touch on Chuck's question first, but then maybe we can walk through what the very initial draft is on the modeling protocols, and we have time to develop those further.
Go ahead.
Oh, just real quick, I just want to remind everyone too, I think the purpose of this, right, is this is like the first step for Denver down this pathway. It is not supposed to be for every building, and it won't be for every building, right? So if you do have that office that has a ton of retail and restaurant and all those things, it just might not work, right? And I think we're okay with the idea behind this is that's okay, but just can we get a large portion of buildings that can at least look at this and start, down that pathway.
And for those, go ahead, Sue.
Oh, thanks. But I do think it's important that there's some guidance here around those other uses and buildings. So if I have a multifamily and less than 10% of the areas for other uses, I may decide to use this approach, but I still have to model those, especially higher intensity uses in the building. I can't just ignore that I've got a restaurant, especially in a hotel where you can have these higher uses in the building. But I do recommend that we include some guidance there, because otherwise City of Denver is going to just deal with a lot of questions repeatedly from all of us. So I think it's better that we address that head on.
So for those two occupancies that have been the discussion, retail and restaurants, the prototype EUIs are either very consistent with Energized Denver targets, or in the case of restaurant, the prototype EUI is way worse. And that's because it's a worst case scenario restaurant, as opposed to, you know, the mix of real restaurants that that Denver has. So in that case, it might be reasonable to set EUIs for those two occupancies, to ensure, you know, making sure that they meet Energized Denver and are consistent with kind of the targets for new construction for the Denver Energy Code. So it probably would be possible to add those two EUI types if people are comfortable with them.
Yeah, I think so too. Just definitely for getting like a weighted average for, like, you know, like was brought up for most buildings that have some level of retail or restaurant on the first floor.
Does anyone disagree with that? If not, maybe we add that, and we need to add language about the weighted average, because I've heard everyone say they'd like that. Do you want to just kind of type in quick placeholders that we want to do those two things?
Sure.
And I'll pause to see if anyone disagrees, and then we'll go to Christy. Okay, go ahead, Christy. Anything else?
So I think what I'm trying to sort out in my brain is I'm okay with everything that we're saying there, with the question for me being that we want to be sure that whatever we're saying that we're going to target for those spaces is actually something that we think, like, if these new buildings are making assumptions to get to those targets, then we're setting them up for failure again. So I think, because I wasn't in the development of the proposal, I'm not sure exactly how much you got into the weeds of how predictive the modeling, say, would be for the restaurant space, when, you know, a spec office building or a residential building will have a restaurant space and it'll be empty and it might not be leased for a couple of years. So they don't really know who that tenant is. So they're going to make a bunch of assumptions on behalf of the tenant. So if we have pretty aggressive targets for it, that's great. But we want to make sure that the owners of the buildings understand those targets adequately when they go to lease those spaces, so that we don't set them up to fail once Energized Denver targets have to be met.
It's a great question, Christy. I mean, the restaurant in particular, I'd love to hear a little more discussion on. I think retail's more similar to between stores, but restaurant varies vastly. If you have a salad shop or a pizza place, and in Energized Denver sort of takes an average, it sounds like the Ashtray one samples were kind of a worst case, you were saying, Sean, but somebody could have a loophole if they, you know, end up putting in a salad joint.
I think.
Do we?
Go ahead, Taylor.
I was just wondering, do we exclude it? Right? I mean, exactly to Christy's point, they don't even know what's going in there. It's probably not a big portion of the design. So is it really that we're trying to focus on the actual main part of the building and hitting that EUI? So is that just neutralized or excluded somehow? I don't know, but
I also think that would be very legit, because remember, when you report for Energized Denver, a restaurant space can be excluded as long as it's separately metered. It's just excluded from the square footage, and it's excluded from the energy use that's reported, because it's hard to benchmark and compare one to another.
And at
I
that
think
point,
also,
the model doesn't matter anymore. I mean, these buildings that permit with the PEUI, when they actually go to meet Energized Denver, they're going to be under the higher numbers anyway, right? Like I may permit at a 38 on a multifamily, but it's going to have to meet a target of 44 in 2030, right?
Mhm.
So we all said we have this switch and buffer for all these projects built in already.
That's right. We could show a couple examples, and I don't know if like Derek has them off the top of his head, but that restaurant can really throw things like we're seeing in office if they have 5% restaurant. We do have a restaurant target, like in case someone didn't have their restaurant in Energized Denver, in case the restaurant's not sub-metered, in case like a restaurant's over 25,000 square feet, which I think is rare. Well, if you factor that restaurant target in, it can take the office targets from 48 to 55. Even if it's 5% of the square footage. And so I think the same would be true here, right? Where it can really affect the overall target you're hitting for your building, but maybe that doesn't matter in the model because that you're saying like, anyway, I'd love to hear more of like kind of where should we land on restaurants?
So I kind of think that there are two philosophies that we could take on it, and I haven't thought through them well enough to have an opinion yet. One would be that we exclude it because it's unpredictable and they can vary so widely. The other would be to say that we do set some parameters around it, which would then require either certain restaurants to go into buildings, which is not what we want. We don't want to limit the restaurant types, or it would require restaurant tenants to think about how they use energy and find different ways to do what they do, which could be a benefit. But if we did that, we would want to be really careful about how we're doing that so that we're not penalizing certain restaurant types or business types and driving them out. So it's a little bit treacherous to propose that, but if we just exclude the restaurants, then I mean, I've seen some pretty obscene things in the designs that restaurants put forth, and so just excluding them allows that to continue unfettered.
It's true, but it's already the case under Energized Denver that if they're less than 10% of the square footage, they can just be excluded, and it existing spaces, it sort of continues a bit unfettered because it's not simple to regulate, so it's not included today.
And I think that that's where the targets that come out of Energized Denver are actually useful, because the targets for restaurant bar really are fairly. They would exclude the egregious restaurant practices because you just wouldn't be able to meet those targets if you're doing the egregious stuff in a restaurant. And then the retail is fairly consistent with new construction. And I think in the case of mixed occupancies, the reality is that the building envelope is probably going to be driven by the dominant occupancy anyway. They're not going to, it's like, oh, I've got a restaurant here or some other occupancy here. I'm going to change my building envelope structure just in this section because I can get away with something different. It just doesn't make sense from a construction cost standpoint. So I think that because of where the Energized Denver targets are, we're actually in pretty good shape for this. Probably the only real concern might be that, yeah, if it's a salad bar that goes in, does that give it a gimme because it's an EUI that assumes cooking equipment?
But it's only that space that's modeled to that EUI. Is that right, Sean? Because I guess that's what I was trying to understand. The rest of the building is still modeled to the target for office, and that's the rest of the building that will then fall under the Energized Denver regulations. The salad or pizza place would be excluded from Energized Denver if it's sub-metered. So I think I'm hearing that Sean would say put in retail and restaurant. That sound okay to everyone else? Does anyone disagree with that after this discussion? Because I do want to look at the modeling protocols and keep us moving. See nods of yes. Okay. We'll do it 10% better than Energized Denver.
And I did want to highlight that we do have the weighted average language in here, and just check to see if this is sufficient for people or if we need any modifications to this.
I think most people who've been doing modeling for a few years of BMP would get that pretty simply.
Okay.
That's my take.
I'm always surprised somehow when people don't seem to understand weighted averages. Every once in a while it pops up. All right, let me switch over to the other one.
I think everyone will be learning it too, at least in the existing building space. That's how Energized Denver works also for weighted targets for these mixed use buildings.
All right. So because this was drafted a while ago, you even get to see some of NBI's comments on this as we were doing our internal development. And really what these rules and procedures do is they modify the way that something is modeled under Appendix G so that it can use a performance target instead of a reference model. And this really does require changes to almost every section of Appendix G as we go through. So we do have a couple of modifications to documentation, and I'll go through this. I'll try to do it, since this is a little bit longer, just an overview of what each of the parts do, and then I know that we have some specific things to discuss. So we do have, it does include something very specific about simulation software, so we will talk about that and about the climate software that is used. Then it modifies the tables, and for the most part, it's modifications to the proposed building performance. And most of these changes, but not all, are about things in Appendix G that you hold constant between your proposed and reference case. So, you know, it says it can be whatever you want it to be, but it has to be the same in the two. And since there's no reference case, we have to be more specific about what those modeling inputs need to be. So that's what most of the modifications to the tables include. We do have some more specific guidance around ventilation because of the same issue. And then we get into the schedules. And as mentioned before, these schedules come out of ComNet. We can't just reference ComNet because ComNet has not been updated for 2019, but we can pull the things out of ComNet that we want to use. And that's what these schedules come from. So all of this comes either from ComNet or from behind the scenes at ComNet. Since NBI was involved in developing ComNet, we have a little bit more visibility into its contents than maybe some other people do. And it establishes all the schedules for just about everything. And then it also includes equipment power densities. So this would be, and then occupancy density, sensible heat gain, latent heat gain, ventilation rate, and then it also just gives you, it lines up schedules to whole building categories. And so it does that mapping. And I believe, yep. So those are the things that we have pulled forward from ComNet. Do we want to start with that discussion of simulation software, or do we want to start somewhere else?
That's fine.
All right, so the reason that this draft limited this to Energy Plus and a specific version is that we have heard from Pacific Northwest National Lab that you can get some fairly substantial differences by switching simulation program. You can even get occasionally substantial differences moving from one version to another. And in response to that comment, we went ahead and just specified, use this software, this version. It doesn't have to be that way, but we would need to recognize that you do introduce increased variability for the more versions of the software that you allow to be used.
Sean, I
So you
know,
saying, go ahead.
sorry, Kristen from Boulder recommended Equest as well. So I just want to bring that into the discussion.
I mean, I don't know if you can limit the software, right? That becomes like California route now, right? Like you either use Energy Pro or you use IES, and the engine is some kind of modified version of Energy Plus. But yeah, I mean, folks are using IES in town. I don't know what you guys are using, Taylor and others who do modeling, but we're using Equest in several places, IES, Energy Plus. I mean, it's a mixed bag of what I'm just telling you, and what we're using on a day in, day out basis on the different projects we're modeling. So I don't know how you can just say Energy Plus version.
Yeah, I agree with just saying that it has to meet the requirements of the standards that the software does, and I believe Appendix G does reference that. So if we could just reference that, or
ASHRAE standard 140 or some validated tool. I mean, otherwise it's going to cause a riot in town. Not everyone is, hiring the modelers that are using Energy Plus. Some folks want to do it in-house as long as they have PMP or they are PE engineers or something. I mean, they might use Trace 3D, which is pretty good now, if you can figure that one out. There's so many things that folks are going to be using for code compliance.
Yeah, from the AHJ perspective, we can settle that pretty easily. I mean, we've got to reference the standard and not the product.
So right now, Appendix G, the references are a little bit roundabout, but Appendix G says that the software has to meet the standards in Section 11 for simulation software, which tells you that the software has to meet ASHRAE 140 except for 2 of the sections. And I don't know the insides of software validation well enough to know why those 2 sections are excluded, but we do have a simulation certification already in Appendix G. So if we don't put anything, then you would get that ASHRAE 140 minus Section 8 and 9, I think is what I looked up.
Yeah, and that's really what we should be using.
7 and 8. I don't know if that makes a difference.
Courtney, what were the 2 softwares that Kristen and Boulder called out specifically as sort of not being sufficient in her opinion? And I'm wondering if those meet that ASHRAE standard.
It was Trace and Carrier version.
HAP, the Carrier's HAP. It's a HAP hourly analysis program. Those don't do it. I don't know what Taylor thinks, but I think Trace has already pulled support for Trace 700. So the entire engineering community and the entire North America is going to have to move to Trace 3D. That's kind of.
Yeah, I think it's kind of convoluted. Trace 3D now uses Energy Plus, right?
Yep,
so
exactly.
But then the old Trace doesn't, and HAP doesn't. So, and I don't know if they meet I assume they do meet the requirements of 140 actually, though.
Okay, we could double check with Kristen, but maybe she was referring to that older version of Trace.
That
we're okay with the ASHRAE standard, I guess.
Yeah, I think the Taylor, the support is being pulled for Trace. That's what we're seeing in our office, at least. Conversations about how to migrate to Trace 3D for the load calcs, not necessarily for energy modeling or code compliance, but.
Yeah, my kind of opinion was just kind of jumps again. I think you want to regulate more of the modeler. So any software is just a tool, right? So everyone has issues and things that happen. And so I don't think the city should just say use one.
Use that.
But I think, it's got to be up to the modeler, and then you've got to make sure or try your best to make sure the modeler's doing their best.
So Trace 700, and I don't know how that corresponds to Trace 3D, does meet the ASHRAE standard 140. I know that previous versions did not.
So isn't it easier for us to just go off the standard? I mean, it just seems like we're excluding and including certain ones or different cities who have had a good opinion, and it's just that, an opinion of the way that software works. I would second what some of the other people were saying. We go off of the standard. It keeps us out of problems and courts and stuff like that. That's the standard. If it meets the standard, it's acceptable.
And so if we just delete this section from the modeling guidance, then it just defaults what's in Appendix G right now.
I think that's fine.
Yeah, does anyone disagree with that? Sounds like that sounds good, Sean. Sean, I know we only have, 14 more minutes today. I'd like to see if there's a couple more things that we need to sort through with this group. I think our goal for today is to understand that we can write these protocols such that, right, we don't have to finalize these before this goes to the code committee. But we need to know that we can write them in a way that will make everyone comfortable with this path. So I actually might turn to Chuck and Eric to ask sort of what else do you need to understand about these protocols? How much do you need to feel like these are final before this code proposal goes to the committee versus are you okay waiting? Because that's really your call on like sort of when do these need to be developed? And do you have other fundamental questions around like sort of from the group today or, guidance from you on process would be most welcome.
Yeah, I'll chime in on the completeness of the documentation. It needs to be complete so that the committee has reference to it during the formal code hearing discussion. That isn't to say that there aren't modifications that couldn't be made thereafter, but it needs to be an essentially complete draft of the document.
Okay, that's helpful guidance. Let's see if we can get a little bit more feedback then for you, Sean, in a couple areas where you had questions. Do you want to walk through? Yeah, let's start with schedules. We may not get through all of this today, but I think we can always circle back in the last meeting too. But if we can get some high level guidance on some of the real critical questions, then we can come back with a more complete draft like in your last meeting.
Yeah, I think one of the things with these tables, and this is the tension with using targets, is if you consider the building an asset that could be used in different ways versus a building that is only designed for its first use. And I think that's one of the things behind the ComNet schedules is that they're kind of more in case the building isn't used in this special way in it during its first use and gets changed to a more typical use, you want the building to still be able to perform. And I think that with a targets approach, there's always this tension, between what the actual schedules and occupancy densities and plug load densities are going to be versus what they might be in the future. And so you need to make sure that you're designing it so that it's efficient under different uses. And I think finding the best way to deal with that in these schedules and in these density numbers is, I think, an important piece of this document. I think the language says this, but if not, this is definitely the Boulder approach, which is use these unless the code official says you can use something else.
Yeah, and I think what's hard about that is a couple items. Well, one is, yeah, Boulder, I think, alluded to this, right? Like some of their plug loads for multifamily, honestly, using these were just like crazy. And it was like you could never meet their EUI because they were so high. And they adjusted that regardless. But I think that idea of having to ask a building official is really difficult just timing wise, right? I mean, projects are trying to make major decisions like really early, like, so they might not even be in for SDP or anything like that when we're trying to assist them. So if we have to get a building approval to be like, hey, we're going to use a different schedule, so that gets a little crazy. So I think my recommendation for this would be use these schedules. If you don't, document, right? Like that has to be a major part of your documentation in your submittal to the city of, hey, we changed this schedule or this load, and this is why.
So in terms of language, I think there's a couple of ways that we could approach that. One would be, provide documentation substantiating the reason. You can say provide documentation substantiating the reason acceptable to the code official, which doesn't make it approval, but does involve the code official somewhat. You could set something in a percent difference, that if your input is X% different, usually higher or I'm lower actually is the one they would worry about, then these numbers, then you have to get approval for that. So if it were something like 30% or 40%, you know, so a really drastic difference from then maybe we do still, you know, include code official approval. So there's kind of a couple varying degrees of interaction with the code official that we could do here, and finding the appropriate one, both for the code officials and for the modelers, I think is an important part of the discussion.
Christy, do you have a comment on that or otherwise?
Yeah, so I guess the way that I'm seeing it, the way that in my ideal happy world we would write it, it would be that we can use the worst of either your actual anticipated use values or what's in the schedule, but allowing project teams to do something that, to make an assumption that is going to result in limited flexibility in the use of the building in the future under the same use category that they're already coming in under seems a little bit like we're setting owners up again to fail relative to Energized Denver targets. And so, because yeah, sure, we might be building a building for a specific user today, but if that building, great, if that building lasts for 75 years, that user may not be there anymore. And so in my mind, I would want to require that flexibility to be built into a certain extent. So I wouldn't really want to see justification saying, well, we're just going to use this building in this really special way, and therefore, we're going to be relaxed from the standards. I would want to see the schedules are the backstop, but we also, I don't want schedules defining predictive modeling. I want teams looking at what they actually expect and comparing that against the schedule and then picking the worst of the two.
And Christy, that's honestly more of what that is if, like looking at offices, if we use these, I think an office could pass really easy, but we're seeing that, that's not how they actually operate. So I think that's
I'll vouch for that. We work with some top property management companies in the country, if not the world. And if you scroll to the next page over here, you'll see office plug load is 1.76 or 6 something. Trust me, we're using easily double of that for our ventilation calcs and our cooling calcs. And those towers, the high-rise offices, are still coming in around 35, 40 EUI. So there's ways. I'm just saying, if you look at office here, open and closed.
Mm-hmm. It's an
Yeah,
image, so I can't highlight it.
1.67. Right, 6 and 7 down at the bottom there. Now we're using easily double of that, if not a little bit more, which is what Christy just said, that allows that property management company to afford or allow the flexibility of usage over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years.
So then I guess what I would want to see is, if this is truly the backstop, then I'm just trying to think of it from a plan review standpoint and from a making sure that between the modeling protocols and the modeler protocols, we have everything outlined so that we get good models. We won't be able to tell when an energy model report gets submitted, whether the schedules were relied upon in a confident way or the schedules were relied upon in a lazy way. But we would want to know, where does the building's anticipated performance fall relative to the schedule? Does that make it's because I can't judge. If I just get a model, I can't judge. If the model has all of the schedule values in it, that raises a flag. But how do we know?
So I don't know if I'm answering the question. When we turn in a report, whether it's for USGBC or for energy code compliance, any jurisdiction anywhere other than ComCheck, we have a simple table there, which also I think LEED requires, which is what are your inputs for your base building and what are you assuming in yours? So side by side. And you could see, if you get to that table of plug loads or equipment power density, you could probably see what's being assumed. And then you could say, oh, look, that's so much lower than the stable or so much higher. Maybe you can ask the question and get some clarification.
So, yeah, sort of. I guess what I'm saying is it's what's the baseline, then what are you assuming? And then which one is the worst value? That's what you had to plug into the model. But it's still so I just want to make sure we don't wind up in a boat which is what I used to experience, where we don't give enough information to the energy modelers from the design team side or from the owner's side, and the energy modeler is left making assumptions, and the model becomes less and less predictive in that environment. But it's really hard to get, and maybe you're experiencing something different now, so tell me if I'm just off track on this.
Yeah.
In my private practice world, it was really hard to get good information
Yes.
and good engagement from owners, helping us understand how they were going to actually use their building.
No, that's really good point. If you want to continue, I'll tell you. Now with this Energized Denver thing, which is going to not be based on how great or shitty I modeled it or Taylor modeled it, it's going to be based on the utility data that you're going to get, right? That's going to determine the EUI. We are a lot more alert or sensitive that we need to extract that information, because I don't want to look bad by every model that comes out of ME or Group 14 is complying, but from Energized Denver 3 years down the road, they are all using 2 to 3 times energy. I mean, that just looks horrible for us. So we are very mindful that we are trying to thread a needle to try and make that model as accurate possible, because whether you like it or not, it's going to be compared to what data is uploaded on that Energized Denver map. And if they'll know between which firms are producing reports that are all complying and not a single building is complying to energy. We're having that conversation every day for the last few months now.
Okay.
I wonder if we could write in some language, Sean, that addresses that, so that it prompts that to be explained when the submission is made. How did you arrive at this based on how the building will actually be used? Then it would be a bit of narrative. And Christy, would that start, or Christy, do you have another proposal of like what might be added here that would make that more reviewable?
No, that's, well, so where I was sort of going was towards what Mohit was saying. How we communicate is, I'm not sure how to put it in here necessarily. I think how we communicate with development teams in general who are developing in Denver about Energized Denver is going to be the critical factor, because that'll get them to participate the way that Mohit, you are able to get them to participate. Now, I'm scared that you guys are getting them to participate this way, but there might be an energy modeler. Like every once in a while, we get a project that's modeled by somebody out of town, and they just might not have Energized Denver on the mind, and so they could then give us a modeling report. And I don't think that there's any way for us to get so far into the weeds that we're understanding how they made their assumptions with their developer. Like, that's not a good thing for us to be trying to review for. So the flip side is then we've got to make sure, and maybe there's a way, Eric and Chuck, that we can talk about through the plan review process, that we make sure that we are communicating to teams that choose this pathway about Energized Denver and the consequences if their assumptions are not well informed.
To that.
And maybe we could put something in here for those out of town teams that just tells them Energized Denver exists. Your building will actually have to perform. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Sean, but just, it's not procedure, right?
Well,
but
actually,
it's
I
just
was
like FYI, this may not be an appropriate place for an FYI, but that way they would get it before they actually come into the review process. They would see, you should go read this. You need to be aware of this regulation and have these conversations in a more in-depth way, like a little like introductory guidance or something at the beginning of this.
So we could start with these as the starting point, and then say, if you deviate from these, you have to provide documentation about why you deviate, and in that documentation, some kind of assurance that the building will still meet Energized Denver. That it could be, you could highlight it there whenever they have to document deviation from the schedules. You could do the thing that I was saying, where if you deviate by more than a certain percentage, then you have to get approval of the code official. Another thing that you could do is say, if you deviate from these schedules, you have to submit a model of your building that has these schedules, and show that it still beats Energized Denver by 10% or something like that, as a backstop. That if your building is operated in, what these schedules are meant to identify as a prototypical way, that they would still meet Energized Denver. I mean, that's you know, it's another model for the modelers, so that's shouldn't be ignored. But that is something that we could add in.
I know folks need to hop, but I actually heard something different. So I just wanted to check this. If you have one more second, Taylor and Mohi, I think I heard Christy saying like that you have to, that you can pick these schedules or you can pick something that is more likely to perform than these schedules. Worse.
I think she was talking about what's more realistically happening in the building versus these numbers that are listed.
Yeah, I think what's hard is I think everyone, there's two sides, right? Everyone, one is worried about, oh, I'm going to game it, and then this building's just going to pass because it has terrible schedules. I'm actually less worried about that because of Energized Denver. I'm more worried, oh, these schedules for offices are easy, right? So everyone just uses these schedules.
Right. So like, what if it said you can do this or something more stringent than this, right? You can do this or you can do something that would like be like worse schedules, and so they would result in high, right? I'm trying to think, like, do you know what I'm like? Is this is this the worst?
I think this could be the backstop. This could be
this is the backstop.
Yeah,
we
could
figure out how to
definitely
word that. But do you like this being the backstop?
Yeah, that's possible because Energized Denver is going to be where the rubber meets the road. It doesn't matter what I model and get the building through. That means I'm doing a disservice to my client by getting his building to pass, knowing fully well deep down that's ethical problem. It's like, you know what? I know your building's not going to work like this. You're just going to get screwed 3 years from now. I mean, that doesn't do well for me or for Taylor for that matter.
So we let you do, so you don't have to run this. You can run something that will result in a higher performing building than this because it's a worse set of, or less ambitious set of schedules, or whatever is more realistic set of schedules, right? This is the
best. Always use worse. You don't have to ask permission to use worse, but you do have to ask permission to use better.
But yeah, I think that makes sense. And
which is what Asher had it too, right? It just said your plug load cannot be less than 25%. Remember, it had that thing in there. If you're using less than 25% process load, you have to explain why your building has to. So
yeah. And I don't know that Eric wants to have that oversight of like, what if it's of approving other things. So we should ask him before. My sense is he doesn't.
Yeah. I was going to just say the same thing. I don't want to speak for the chief, for Eric, but I would imagine that he wouldn't want the onus on all that coming to him to have that approval. But
we're not Boulder, where it's a small volume of projects, and we don't have a Kristen Whitco that's just dedicated to this. Like, you do these schedules, or you do something that these are the backstop, or you do something that is going to result in even a higher performing building than these schedules. Hard stop, I think, if you all are okay with that.
And maybe he does want to overlook that. I don't know. It's a question you have to ask him. But judging on some of the other committees we've been on, I know we've kind of diverted away from that. But something you'd have to run through him.
That's my guess. Unless someone has a big problem with that, my sense from Eric is that he always asks that we not punt things to his discretion.
And just
can you blame him?
Separate kind of item too that needs to be in here is something on elevation derating for gas equipment. Just for Denver, that is important when you're looking at EUIs. Hopefully people aren't doing gas, but there probably still will be in some, domestic hot water or what have you. So we just need to add that in there.
If you have what you think is the right derating for that, I would appreciate it if you share it.
Okay, yeah, we can. It gets a little complicated with condensing versus non-condensing, but I think we have a pretty good framework we can share, Sean.
Okay.
Thank you. Sean, on next steps, do you have enough input just to run this from here to have a final draft of the proposal and a final set of protocols drafted for the group's 4th meeting when we circle back to this? Or do you need some more help from Taylor or from others? Do you need more side conversations?
I don't think so, but I think that I would appreciate eyes on what I draft before it comes back to the main group.
Okay. Happy to help if it comes to me.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Mohi. I think we'll, and actually because Linda and Elizabeth weren't here, like maybe we try to have this ready for the next meeting. It's not a topic on the agenda, but then Linda and Elizabeth can see it also. They're the actual committee members. So maybe we just send it to like the 4 stakeholders and don't trouble like the CPD inboxes again, Sean, with a draft in about 2 weeks, and then we can refine a bit if we need to, or you know, you and I can do a briefing with Linda and Elizabeth to get their input offline, and we can then circle around the 4th meeting and hopefully have something that at least all the stakeholders feel really good about.
All right.
Okay, my
Or
sense
at
is
least
CPD
send
will
it. I
sort of
mean, we don't
defer to
mind
all of
reading
you
it.
on this because because this isn't something that, you know, they don't have a bunch of modelers on staff, right? So I think you all are the ones we need to have feeling really good about this stuff. Okay.
You can still send it. We don't have a problem with that. Yeah, still send it. We still like to see it.
Okay, yeah, Antonio, if you'd like to, I'm trying to be real conscious of not overfilling Chuck and Eric's inboxes, but we can send it to everybody in the working group. Okay, that sounds good.
It's
Especially if you'd like to see
beneficial
it.
when we look at it. It really is. I don't want to keep anybody, but if you can, it's just beneficial to actually see it.
That sounds good. We'll do a round of written input, offer any side conversations, and then hopefully we wrap it up in the 4th meeting. Thank you all. Thank you for staying over a little bit.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
No, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.